News and information 570 KLIF.
Joining us now is attorney Trey Branham from Branham Law. There's a very interesting case going on where a Chicago cop has sued for overtime pay for the time he spent working from home on his department-issued BlackBerry. Trey, thanks for joining us. What could this case ultimately mean?
Yeah, what you need to know first is that there's a federal law called the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted back in the 1930s, and that is the law that essentially created the 40-hour work week. It's what gave us weekends. Before that, there was no limit on the number of hours a employer could force an employee to work at an hourly rate. And so after that law, and the whole point was back in the Depression to put people to work, obviously. And so that law mandates time and a half, and everybody's familiar with time and a half.
Right.
And so what you've got is police officers and security guards and folks who work at McDonald's and folks who are paralegals and folks who don't fall into some very narrow exemptions are what's called non-exempt employees, which means you got to pay them overtime. And it doesn't matter whether they're salaried. If you can be a police officer who's salaried at $35,000 a year, that doesn't mean you don't get overtime. Just because you're a salaried employee does not mean you're exempt. And so it's a law, candidly, that a lot of employers get caught up in because they don't seek out the right advice or they're trying to get by on the cheap or what have you. But anytime an employee who is non-exempt, which is in this case a police officer, is working, they're entitled to be paid overtime. And the real catch for the law is that it's up to the employer to figure out whether or not the employee is working. So what's happened in a lot of these situations, like this police officer, where we are involved in texting and phone calls and all of those things, is that departments have begun to take away those devices or not provide them. And because those employers understand that they can be held responsible for overtime. What's going on is that officer will win that lawsuit. I'm very confident in that. I read with a little bit of concern that the mayor of Chicago was sort of laughing it off. It's a big problem for the city if a lot of people get into that case, because it's a big dollar case.
Talking to attorney Trey Branham, and this is so fascinating because, we almost live in a world where we are total access at all times. And I guess the laws they're there, but I don't necessarily know that they're clear that say, like this officer, if you get a call at 7 o'clock at night, if they supplied him with the gizmo, then basically you're saying it's okay to take it, and so it's okay for you to work. And now they're saying we don't want to pay you. Pretty much is.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same principle that anybody, if you're working, and let me give you an example from my standpoint. As a lawyer, people call me whenever they need to talk to me.
Right.
Now, I'm a non-exempt employee. There's an exemption for professionals, which I'm considered. But nevertheless, when my clients call me at 6 o'clock at night, they expect to get billed for it. That's not a shock to them. Same principle here. If you're calling your employee when he's on his off time about a work-related matter or asking him to do something work-related, he expects to get paid. That's not a shock to anybody. We none of us work for free, and we may feel like we do sometimes. But you pay people what they're owed, and that's really all this law is designed to do.
Does he open up himself for repercussions?
Well, it's very interesting. If there was any sort of retaliation, that's a separate and distinct violation of the law.
Yep.
There is a retaliation provision under the Fair Labor Standards Act. If an employer retaliates for either an inquiry about overtime or the bringing of a lawsuit about overtime, that's a whole different cause of action, and the employer can get into a world of trouble with a federal court.
Do you get a sense, though, a lot of people are afraid, and that's why they don't make it a bigger case, and this officer finally says, I've had enough, and I'm going to do this?
Yeah, it's really common that when these cases get brought, it's after an employee has left the employer. That's common. That's not surprising. But at the same time, I've had plenty of cases where the employee brings the case while they're still employed. And inevitably, you see that followed up by a retaliation, claim that's additionally having to be brought because they've been terminated or demoted or stuck in a broom closet or whatever. And you can't do that.
Do you think they'll have a settlement out of court, or do you think this will go all the way?
Yeah, you never know. These cases rarely go to trial because the law is so settled. In this case, what's happened is that the court has approved what's called an opt-in class, which means that the court has certified a class action. But as opposed to your typical class actions where everybody is automatically included, and if you don't want to be included, you have to say, I don't want to be included. In this case, if you want to be included, you have to affirmatively say, I want to be included and fill out a form. And so notice will go out presumably to all of the police officers in Chicago, and they will say, yes, I want to be a part of this. Once that process is finished and they know how big the class is, then the case is ripe for settlement and resolution. Most of these cases are resolved through settlement because, again, the law is so clear. And I would bet that's what happens here.
I would think in Chicago, wouldn't they have a union? And why did they not get involved?
Yeah, I don't actually know. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a union, and you'll have some sort of negotiated wage issue. And
Makes
without
sense.
knowing exactly what the union contract says, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the union role will be in that.
Trey, I appreciate it. It's fascinating because it's one of those things you know it happens from time to time, and you're just curious if anyone really, if they're afraid of doing anything about it. I'm glad that he's sticking up for it.
Yep. Thanks very much for your time.
Attorney Trey Branham, KLIF News Time. It is 4:22. Mavs Bucks tonight at the Double AC. We've got sports coming up in 1 minute with Ty Walker at 4:23. Right now, it's a check of your money.